I welcome Nikolai for coming to our foundation. We are very glad to have him and his wife, Erwa, here at this foundation. Today we will be talking about the book that Nikolai published in 2016, which is on a very important topic. That is on the privatization of warfare. The title of the book that he published was The Privatization of Warfare, Private Military Companies in Iraq. We all know that this classical understanding of state, starting all the way with Max Weber, is about monopoly of force, monopoly of violence, which means the legal right to bear arms is only in the hands of the state. But what we now see in private military and security companies is that these folks have arms, these folks wage wars in places like Afghanistan, in places like Iraq, even in places like Britain. When there were riots in UK, the British government contracted private military and security companies about how to overcome the riots. So that's an immensely important and interesting topic. A trend that is on the rise, that you have private military companies fighting wars and doing the security work for states. And it has all sorts of complicated and complex questions that it creates. It generates legal questions, political questions, security questions, economic questions, questions about capitalism, questions about international law. So today we'll have Nikolai talk about the privatization of warfare, and his evidence comes mostly from the case of Iraq, the Iraq War. And we'll have a discussion of the issue in about, we'll have a presentation from him for about 30 minutes, 40 minutes. Then we will switch to Q&A, to discussion, to your questions. Nikolai is a PhD candidate at Kingston University in London. He is also a political commentator. He has appeared on the Al Jazeera and other outlets like Voice of Islam Radio, Radio Sputnik, and other outlets expressing his opinions. He also served as the advisor to the Arab Institute for Security Studies in the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, and he also published or appeared in places like venues like Open Democracy, the Small Wars Journal, the Conversation and the Oil and Gas Energy Journal, and others. So we are very happy to have Nikolai with us today, and Nikolai, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Teşekkür. I don't speak much Turkish, so I'm sorry. But anyway, thank you for that wonderful and kind introduction. So indeed, today's topic will be about the privatization of warfare and how we can understand the way that warfare is changing, becoming more commercial, and because of that, asking the question, how do we regulate warfare in this day and age? How do we respond to mercenaries and to the idea that you have staff members for companies who go to war instead of soldiers? So, for example, you'll notice this book cover. We put a price tag on the soldier's rifle. And I insisted on this on purpose because I wanted to make a point, the image of warfare being commercial, war being a business. It's a very disturbing image, but it's also a very true one. Yeah, sorry. No problem at all.
See, those
The blue screen of death or something. Şey yapalım mı? If I can get one. Tamam. Anyway, so what I will discuss today is to explain the facts and figures of private military companies, where they come from, where do they operate, and then I want to look at the Abu Ghraib scandal and what's called the Nasur Square massacre, which was perpetrated by Blackwater in Iraq. And also it's important to look at international law. Now all of you, I'm going to assume, are students of IR, international relations, so I'm sure that you will look at international law because there's always an overlap. So the Montreux document is a very important document for understanding international law within the context of private military companies and how to regulate them. So we're going to talk a bit about that, and as you mentioned, what is state legitimacy? What is the monopoly over violence? It's not as simple as people may think. And I'll discuss my findings as well in my book. So I was very surprised when I first started my book. US companies have become very infamous because of what happened in Iraq. And I was very surprised to find out that the majority of private military companies are actually not American. Almost 60% are European. And this was a shock to me. You know, they operate mainly in Iraq and Afghanistan, also now to an extent in Libya. Iraq and Afghanistan remain the most profitable, but at the same time it's worth noting something. When we use the term private military company or private security, it's a very large term. And European companies, for example, you have European companies who could be in Iraq, but at the same time they have a division where they pay security guards to guard a mall. That's still private security. So you see, it's very, very wide. One of the issues with private military firms is that the tasks they are permitted to do or not is often quite complex. Now, there's this image of mercenarism, this image of the soldier of fortune who's paid to fight in wars. The majority of private military companies do not necessarily engage in that only. Many private military staff, they actually engage in various tasks, such as not just armed security, but maintaining, for example, weapon systems, maintaining buildings in Iraq, things that the government pays them for. So they're not only engaged in security or engaged in military-like tasks. Now, here you will notice this is this is Abu Ghraib, the prison in Baghdad. This is one of the walls. Now, this prison was used by Saddam Hussein before his overthrow. He would hold political prisoners in this place, and of course, after the invasion of Iraq by the United States forces, what happened was that the US took over the prison and they started to hold prisoners there as well. To the right, we have Blackwater's logo. Now, I'm sure all of you have heard of Blackwater and heard about what happened. They have changed their name, I think, at least 2 or 3 times now. They are now known as Academy, and I will talk a bit about that as well. Why did they change their name after what happened at Nasur Square? So, what was the Abu Ghraib abuse scandal? This was a scandal that happened in 2003. Now, Abu Ghraib closed in 2014. That's quite late compared to when the abuses happened. But the abuses, they were roughly late March 2003, and by 2004, the photographed abuse of prisoners had been leaked, and it was, all over the media. It was an outrage. What I found interesting in my research is the fact that in Iraq, you have street markets in Baghdad, in the capital, and so at the time, there are markets where they sell, pirated DVDs, movies, and whatnot. So what happened was that the CD-ROMs that held these photos eventually found their way onto the market. And this is important because it meant that local Iraqis, could purchase these CDs with the photographs and see firsthand the abuse that was going on, Now, one thing that's very interesting about this case is the fact that although contractors were involved, they did not make up the majority of abusers. The majority of those who perpetrated abuse were actually military staff. And we had, at the time at Abu Ghraib, we had less than 40 contractors, according to Donald Rumsfeld, who were employed there. But then the question becomes, what were the tasks they were allowed to do or not? Why was there no oversight or accountability? So there are 2 companies that were involved in these abuses. The first is called Casey. Of course, they're American. They supplied up to 30 interrogators at Abu Ghraib. But also, long before the abuses, they had a very good relationship with the US government. During the Cold War, they got mainly weapons contracts. And after the Cold War came to an end, they branched into IT. Now again, one of the problems I found in my research is that contracts between these companies and the US government are often very vague. It doesn't say, interrogation or torture. They use very vague terms. This company, they were in charge of what's called open and closed intelligence gathering. What does that mean? It basically means that they are in charge of compiling information at the request of the US government, and that information can be publicly available from Wikipedia, and they just compile it and present it to the government the way the government wants. Or it can be classified information. They did both. And in their contracts for Abu Ghraib, they were in charge of what was called human intelligence, which doesn't really tell us anything. It doesn't tell us what the tasks are or how they go about it. And I do feel that was part of the point of that phraseology, to be vague. The second company that was accused of abuses was Titan Inc. Now it's very interesting that they also are an IT company, or I should say that they were, because they have since collapsed. So they were responsible for IT systems related intelligence gathering, and when the abuses happened, they denied everything. They said, oh, we weren't involved. But because of the publicity involving Abu Ghraib and them, they lost a massive deal with Lockheed Martin. Lockheed Martin is a massive aero defense firm. They're huge, and they're still around to this day. Titan Inc., however, they're gone. They eventually folded. And that's interesting, isn't it, that one company went bankrupt, the other company, Casey, they're still around, still making money. So they had about, after the Abu Ghraib abuses, they were still able to get contracts from the US government. They supplied 4,500 translators, including in the Middle East. So again, questions of accountability. It's like these companies can just get away with it. So the second case study of my work was, of course, Blackwater and the Soho Square incident in 2007. Now, I often pause at this point and ask a question. I'm going to ask you all a question here. Look at this photo. The people in this photo, would you call them staff or employees, or would you call them soldiers?
Soldiers.
Right, thank you. You would say soldiers. Anyone else? Same? Yeah, because let's face it, they look like soldiers, don't they? It's very interesting. They look like soldiers. They dress like soldiers. They're carrying weapons. They have bulletproof vests, but they don't have identity tags. They don't have a flag of a country. They don't even have the name Blackwater, as far as I can tell. But they look like soldiers. And the question then becomes, where do you draw the line? How do you legally define a soldier? You see, now this is very interesting because it's not that clear cut. Legally, they are actually not soldiers. They are civilians, and some of them may actually be former soldiers who served in the U.S. Army and then started working for a private company like Blackwater that wanted them for their expertise in the military, you see. Now, the Soho Square incident in Baghdad was basically where Blackwater was accused of opening fire on 17 unarmed civilians. And this is different because while Abu Ghraib is a case in which we have a mix of contractors and the military, with Blackwater's incident in Soho Square, it's all on them. The US military was not involved. It's all Blackwater's fault, to put it bluntly. At the same time, there's a lack of legal closure that I will also discuss. What that means is basically that Blackwater was not officially prosecuted in the end. They were found guilty, but the Supreme Court overturned that. So then the question becomes, so how do you prosecute? How do you find justice? Especially because under international law and local laws, you cannot prosecute a company. You have to go after the individuals who perpetrated the crime.
What happened? What's
Yeah.
the importance of this square? What happened there?
Well, I'll talk about it in just a second. Yeah. So to go back to the Soho Square, this is an account of what happened. So in a nutshell, what happened was this. There was a convoy, a collection of vehicles belonging to Blackwater in the Soho Square, which was very crowded. They tried to get a vehicle in front to move, and when the vehicle did not move, they fired on it. They shot, you see, they shot the driver, they shot the passenger in the car, and then after that they continued shooting, and then they ended up killing and harming up to 17 civilians, you see. And this, this happened in this area in the Soho Square. At the end of it, more trucks or vehicles from Blackwater pulled in and tried to get the crowd to disperse using non-lethal means. But by then, the damage had been done. People had been shot. Okay for me to change? Yeah? Tamam? So what I tried to look at for the book was not just the legal reaction, but how did the public react to this event? What do people think about this event? So, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of legal closure, there was a lack of such closure because in 2009, the case against Blackwater was actually dismissed. The prosecution was accused of tampering with evidence that could have jailed the perpetrators of the crime, so the case was just tossed out. And there was very little that actually happened against the staff. You see, in Iraq, the Iraqis couldn't do much. The only thing they could do was withdraw the license for Blackwater to operate in Iraq, and it was already expired by then, that license. What we do see happening at this time, however, we see a rise of literature on private military companies, especially after this incident. A lot of criticism. People asking, okay, how do we regulate the private military sector? How is this possible? I've written here one author I highly recommend, E.L. Gaston. He wrote for, I believe, Harvard Law Review. He has a very interesting article in which he argues that the only way you can tackle private military companies is by changing international law. Now, in international law we have norms, right? We have regulation. The problem is international law is meant to regulate behavior between states. Now what we're seeing is what I call non-state political actors. Companies becoming as powerful as some countries. And how do you regulate them? Perhaps the only way to do it is to have new laws. At the same time, from my research, I found that you need to involve governments, civil society, and the industry itself. And this is a problem because the industry will not get involved unless it's in charge of how the laws work. So, moving on to the Montreux document, which is a very important but also somewhat ineffective document and how it's implemented in Iraq and the USA. This document has attempted to address the private military issue. Now, the main elements of this document are to determine what tasks private military companies are allowed to do. Okay? To say, okay, here's a list of the tasks that private military companies can do. It also argues for vetting. What that means is that there should be a licensing framework. So if a private licenses that company before it can start to operate, and it has to fit certain criteria, including safety, legality, and so on and so forth. At the same time, one of the most important things is the vetting of staff. In other words, when a private military company hires new staff members, they have to make sure that the staff are clean. And there have been incidents, for example, let's say you were a staff member working in Blackwater and you were found guilty of something. You could leave Blackwater, go back to the States, and then after a while go back into Iraq and try to get hired with another company. This has happened, and that should not happen, but it's because of lack of accountability, lack of oversight that this occurs, that staff members who have not behaved lawfully can still work in Iraq, but for another company. So what have the US and Iraq done to try to implement this document? Well, as I said earlier, the Montreux document is voluntary. It is not new, it simply restates existing international law. Okay? And we have this problem that the international law itself is about states, not non-state actors. You see, and this is a problem, because we do need new norms. I believe that we need new norms. The United States has to take a leading role because it is a home and contracting state. In other words, there are a certain amount of American companies that, PMCs that go into Iraq, Afghanistan. At the same time, the United States also hires these companies. You could have, for example, the US government could hire an American PMC to go into Libya. Or they could hire a French PMC to go into Libya or Iraq. They'll probably go with the cheapest. Okay? And this is the problem. It really is a business that we're talking about. And it's a business that's profitable. Gaddafi, yeah, there's a rumor that Gaddafi employed mercenaries. Gaddafi, when he was going to collapse, when things were really going bad for him, there's a lot of rumors about what he did and the people he tried to hire. I think that most private military companies would have avoided him simply because it would have caused too much attention. If a private military company is hired by, let's say some leader in the Middle East or a not so nice, client state, they might go for it if there's not much attention on that state. So, there's a lot of countries in Africa or even in South Asia that are not very democratic, but if you don't read about them in the news, a PMC might work for them. If they're in the news every day because their regime is collapsing, PMCs might say, well, we don't want to touch this guy. But yeah, but you're right. That's a very good point. It was quite. There was a rumor that he was using mercenaries and flying them in from Africa, I believe, during the final days. But anyway, so we're talking here in Iraq and Afghanistan alone, over the past few years, almost $200 billion worth of contracts. So you see, the part of the problem is it's profitable. A business that is profitable does not necessarily want to be regulated. It really is about the money. And the US itself, it does have a lot of regulation out there, but a lot of that regulation is lacking. There's been a lack of prosecution. I've written here what's called the Military Extraterritorial Judicial Act, which simply means that if I'm a member of the US Armed Forces and I'm abroad and I commit an act that's illegal in the US, I can be prosecuted. But you see, already we have a problem because this is for the members of the armed forces, not for private military staff. Private military staff cannot be affected by this law. So there's still a serious lack of regulation addressing private military companies. As for Iraq, well, one of the problems that Iraq has had is that it is a territorial state. It means that private military companies operate on its territory. Sud, right?
Yeah.
Excellent. So my Turkish is improving. Okay, so it is a territorial state that has seen a lot of companies coming in. And I often discuss this, just people are shocked regarding how easy it was in 2003 to set up a private military company. Literally, the United States, they needed companies in and they needed them fast. So you had sometimes, for example, a retired colonel from the US military in Florida who still has contacts in Iraq. He reads about what's happening in the invasion and he calls up his buddies in Iraq and says, I'm going to start a company. And he's got it's literally him, 20 contacts and a home office, and he gets a contract. They needed boots on the ground badly. And Iraq, one of the problems that they have is because the government is weak and it's not very stable, it's very hard for them to actually control what happens with private military companies. I've written here talking about political involvement. This is a very interesting point. In my research, I've discovered that private military companies, not all of them, but some of them, they have gotten politically involved in Iraq. For example, paying tribes and warlords for access to territory or for protection, the sort of things that governments are responsible for, not private companies. And it shows how involved they're getting. In fact, one of the most recent laws from 2013 is the Iraqi oil law. Now, this is a very interesting law. What it means is basically that private military companies are not allowed to guard oil installations in Iraq. And there's a reason they did that, because Iraq is afraid that their sovereignty will be affected. Iraq has a lot of oil, and extracting the oil is actually quite cheap. But it's not stable. And so Iraq is worried that if it allows private military companies to come in to guard the oil installations, these companies, they're German, they're French, they're American. Who do you think they're representing? They represent their home states. They can be used as a political tool to gain leverage over oil in Iraq. So this is a serious problem. And of course, the lack of coordination. Iraq is not able to coordinate with the US regarding the Montego document. It is not able to ensure that these laws are enforced. It doesn't have the political capacity. Now, how do we define state legitimacy? I'm very happy that you mentioned Max Weber, because I'm sure all of you are familiar with Weber and the idea of monopolizing violence, that the state is responsible for that. I've tried to expand on state legitimacy by looking at it as a social contract, and I'm still doing this with most of my work. So, imagine if the state has a social contract between itself and the citizens. What this means is that as a citizen of, let's say, a country in the Gulf, I recognize the state's right to rule in exchange for benefits. Could be money, could be welfare, could be free education, what have you. In exchange for the consent to be ruled, I gain what's called beneficial consequences. And these are things like, getting welfare, having education, first-class public services, or even safety. And this is scary. Safety can be a commodity. Safety can be on the private market. You can you can have a contract where you sign and say, I agree to be ruled by current leader, whatever, in exchange for staying safe. And private military companies can be a part of that. This term here is a bit misleading, democratic approval. This does not mean that people get to vote on every single major decision. It simply means that the state has a process to make decisions. It could be their parliament, it could be 4 people in a closed room, who knows. So the state can say, you know, we offer you safety in exchange for you obeying us. How we provide that safety is our business. That means that they can use private military companies. They decide, you know, how to define safety. They decide how that works. So my findings in the book, to understand the public perception of the relationship between private military companies and the state, I looked at media rhetoric, what's called political communication, rhetorical analysis. So I looked at, across the Middle East and the West, discourse from CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera as well. How do they describe private military companies, and how do they react to the Sohr Square massacre and to Abu Ghraib? I found it very interesting to look at the fact that a lot of PMCs are called security firms, even by the public, you know, and they probably don't mind that because private military companies prefer to be called private security companies. In fact, some of the new legislation that they tried to work on, where governments have tried to involve private military companies, these companies have refused to sign or to cooperate unless they're called security companies in the document. That says something, you know. At the same time, the discourse I found has often been very ironic. So the media might label these guys security companies, but then they say, for example, private security company kills 17 civilians. Private security company accused of abuse. The one example that was different that I found, the exception, was CNN. They're American. And I found it very interesting that they had labeled private military companies as military, not security. The BBC didn't do that, Al Jazeera didn't do that. That's very interesting because they're American. You would expect that they would go with the flow, but they haven't. So, let's see. Yeah. So for Abu Ghraib, again, most media outlets have been consistent. For Abu Ghraib, I found it very interesting that they have labeled Casey and Titan as corporations or contractors. Again, not PMCs, but they often call them American contractors or US corporations. And this is important because I feel it shows that the public expects that there's a state-corporate relationship. What that means is that if the company is American, it's the US government that is responsible if something goes wrong. This is what my research has found. So, really, when it comes to corporate responsibility, the general public expects the United States, if the company is American, to rectify any wrongdoing or to punish these companies for what they've done in the Abu Ghraib abuses. Now, one exception again to this that I found was actually with the BBC. My research or analysis of BBC headlines relating to Abu Ghraib found that Casey, they actually settled out of court. There was a lawsuit by victims of the Abu Ghraib scandals. And when the case was ongoing, the BBC referred to Casey as a US corporation. After the case was settled out of court, they started calling them a defense contractor. And that's very interesting to me because, again, defense is like security, this image of protection. So it's as if Casey was able to buy back its legitimacy, buy back its good image by settling out of court. And that's very disturbing. So my conclusion for my work has been that most PMCs, most private military companies, want to be seen as defensive or protective, not military. The exception would actually be with Blackwater. They've changed their name twice. After 2012, when you look at their website, they use the term military company. They didn't used to do that. And that's very interesting. So it's like they're latching onto this image of being aggressive. And there are some experts who've argued that the market is becoming segmented into private military companies that obey international law and those that are willing to violate it for clients. It's very interesting. So it really shows how this is a market. Now, although I've written here that legitimacy as an image can be revoked, and it's true, I find it interesting that companies, as I said, could buy back their legitimacy. Now, there's a public expectation that states control these companies. So The general public does not have a problem with states outsourcing warfare. It doesn't have a problem with states using private military companies, but they expect states to be responsible for how these companies behave. That is the ultimate point. So thank you very much.
Thank you.